Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started today, I want to remind you that along with supporting the Auron MacIntyre show, one of the amazing benefits of joining the Blaze is that you get to watch some really great documentaries. One of them is called The Cover Up, and it's all about Anthony Fauci and the incredible story about what happened during the COVID pandemic. Episode 5 is dropping tomorrow, and they're really getting into the pandemic industrial complex and the amount of information warfare that was involved in the entire cover up. If you'd like to catch this episode or go back and see all of the episodes so far that you missed, you can head over to faucicoverup.com/Auron and get $20 off your subscription. That's faucicoverup.com/Auron. You get $20 off your subscription. You'll be supporting the show and you'll get to see these amazing documentaries. There's one on the border, there's one on Fauci, there's one on the airlines, and more are coming. So make sure to check it out, guys. All right, so we've had a pair of interesting stories in the news, one a little funny, one very serious, but both touching on the same topic, the amount of anti-white hate that has continued to perpetuate itself inside our society, and the amount of acceptability people feel with the freedom they feel with which they can express this hatred towards white Americans. Joining me today to discuss this topic is one of our favorites, Jay Burden. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you so much, Auron. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss only the most serious news.
Yes. I know that we're all going to enjoy discussing Sydney Sweeney for a few minutes here, but it's not really about the celebrity gossip or celebrity drama. Obviously, this is more of a match that lit a fire, a wider issue that I think is uncovered by the nature of the response. But before we explain the response, I guess we should explain the ad in case there are some people who are not familiar. So Sydney Sweeney is an actress. I'll be honest, I don't think I've seen anything with her in it. I'm trying to think of anything I've actually watched where she was an actress. But obviously, she's got some level of popularity in the culture, and she's an attractive woman. So they put her in a number of advertisements. Most recently, she was in an advertisement for American Eagle jeans. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember American Eagle as kind of like the Abercrombie and Fitch competitor when I was younger, back when I could shop at stores that had those type of names and not look like some weird old man standing around in the corner wondering, what these shirts were about. But they did a ad with her, or a series of ads, I believe, with her. And the theme was Sydney Sweeney has good genes. And, it's just a basic attractive woman putting on jeans type scenario. There's nothing particularly raucous about it. It's not even really that racy compared to, like, you remember those Hardee's ads where they were just putting, women with giant fake breasts in bikinis and having them drip burger juice on themselves. It comparatively very tame with the sexuality. But the thing that people focused on quite a bit to up their outrage was the pun placed inside this ad, which is that obviously she's wearing a pair of blue jeans with a J. But when they say that she has good genes, they might be alluding to the fact that she was born with good genetics, and that is a reason why she is so attractive. Something that pretty much anyone would say, as a joke or an offhand comment over someone who is attractive. If someone said, if you did it with like a Henry Cavill for women, he's got good genes, I don't think there would have been any kind of blink. But instead, we got a bunch of stories about how this is a deeply disturbing Nazi dog whistle. MSNBC was talking about the deep, mid-century German undertones that existed just because someone put an attractive white woman in this advertisement. Now, again, she has been in other advertisements before, but there has been otherwise a lack of a lot of white people in advertisements. Many people have noticed this, that it's very common for you to see a very low proportionate representation of white Americans in the advertisements that are going out to America at this point. And if you do see them, they're usually like the bad guy, or they're part of a family in which they're the only white person for some reason. These are the advertisements you usually see. So do you think that this advertisement backlash was simply due to the context of the word jeans, or is there something deeper going on here?
Yeah, so This may surprise the viewers, but I'm going to go ahead on a limb and say, Auron, neither you or I are deeply embedded into the world of fashion. However, both of us are married, and so by merely having a woman around, you do pick up on these things, right? And all through sort of the extreme excess of woke, the kind of first Trump presidency, going through the Biden years, there was this sort of reveling in, a polite person would say, non-traditional beauty. A more objective eye would say ugliness in the fashion world. So for instance, in many cases, a lot of brands were using extremely overweight models, models with just bizarre looking features, sort of pigment disorders, and extreme focus on quote unquote diversity, right? Which basically means everyone except for white people. And there was sort of an element of virtue signaling in that, right? That was a way to mark yourself out as a socially progressive brand, that you could be associated with. But that sort of built up a culture, right? It sort of built up an expectation that that would be the case. And buried in that, not particularly deeply, was an outright hostility towards white people, right? They are bad and gross and ugly, and we don't want to see them. And, to sort of paraphrase possibly your most important work yet, the sign tapping meme, it really isn't that complicated. They just hate white people. And again, the reaction to this, the pun is innocuous, right? It's a stupid pun. And commenting on the genetics of celebrities is nothing new. If you've ever listened to a UFC broadcast before, you've heard Joe Rogan say the phrase animal genetics, right? For a particularly savage or capable fighter. This is not some sort of eugenic point, right? Everyone recognizes this. And to be honest, if this ad were, had come out 15 years ago, nobody would have noticed. It's not particularly interesting or relevant. But because of the sort of anti-white hatred that is quite popular in both the fashion industry and among the chattering class, it became this sort of great litmus test, right? Do you look at this and say, like, what's the issue? This is just a random model, right? One of dozens for a random brand that, neither of which are particularly controversial in and of themselves. But when shown through that sort of prism of genuine progressive bigotry, it becomes this major issue. And to your point, I think a relevant part of this is that while there certainly is a generalized sort of distaste and hatred for white people generally, obviously due to, shall we say, prominent mid-century leaders, particularly blue eyes and blonde hair are extra demonized, right? Like that is the quote unquote, the evilest and whitest combination, right? Heavy scare quotes on both of those. And so I think the combination of all three, right? A slight reference towards genetics, the fact that this is an attractive, non-diverse model, and then the sort of blue-eyed blonde hair features, it kicked off this giant outpouring. And what was particularly interesting to me, because look, again, these sort of stories really never come across my metaphorical desk. I'm not deeply embedded in the world of fashion. But what I saw in reaction was insane vitriol, right? Saying things that if you swapped around, shall we say, the popular nouns and descriptors, you would be banned off of every social media and lose your job for saying that about another group. But, it is socially acceptable to target the, technical majority population of this country with extreme bigotry, right? Things that, I don't think you should say about anyone, let alone, right, due to something so innocuous.
Yeah, we can see here the MSNBC headline, Sydney Sweeney's ad shows an unbridled cultural shift towards whiteness, as if that's the worst thing imaginable, right? That if the culture had in any way acknowledged the general culture that existed pretty much everywhere in this country until a few decades ago, advertisements are always mirror of society, and sometimes they reflect its ugly. What they reflect is ugly and startling. So obviously, the NBC anchor here, the writer, feels more than comfortable declaring white people to be ugly and startling. Right? There's no hesitation here, and so as you say, this is the kind of language that would absolutely get you destroyed if you put it anywhere else. If the roles were reversed, this would be the worst possible outcome for pretty much anybody. and yet this is totally acceptable. This person's in no danger of losing their job. And I want you to understand this is what we talk about when we say that this stuff has not been put away, right? That ultimately, even if the emphasis is not always there, these cultural flare-ups are just going to keep happening along this woke axis, and these people are going to continue to retain their jobs even when they say something like that. And that's how you know the culture hasn't actually shifted. Are we moving in a direction? Yeah. Are we moving in some direction? Yes. But have we actually won this victory? Have we overcome this problem? Not in the slightest, because people still feel more than capable of making these kind of statements without any kind of repercussions. And either we can all make these kind of comments, or none of us can make these comments. This continued state where you can only make them about white people and about no one else is absolutely insane. It's Radio Rwanda stuff. It's going to get a lot of people killed. And we'll talk about in a minute where it almost did. And these are the kind of attacks that happen all the time. However, I want to stay with the Sydney Sweeney ad for a little bit, because I think it uncovers a couple different layers of the problem we're looking at, right? As you say, the ad itself, whatever, who cares? This is not something that you and I are spending a deep amount of time trying to understand in any intense level. However, the first thing is that the general ugliness that has been presented in fashion, as you were pointing out, the fact that fashion became obsessed with inverting the beauty hierarchy. Now, we've always had this to some extent with fashion, right? They always had a extremely beautiful woman, but they would dress her up in something very ugly, or they would put something very strange, right? They would try to make her look very alien, or in some cases, like push like trash bags on her, right? So there's always some element of trying to subvert the beauty expectation. However, it was always in the context of the model still being a beautiful person. Maybe you were challenging the idea that you had to adorn that beautiful person in different garb, or a specific style, but the individual was always selected because they were still someone who was very attractive. And then I walked into Target for the first time in several years a few months ago, and I was very struck by the fact that they have the little models everywhere, pictures on the ends of kiosks and those kind of things with different people wearing the clothes, and I was struck that everyone was so ugly, like just incredibly ugly. Everyone was fat, everyone was disabled, everyone had skin issues and were missing teeth. Like, it was just crazy at how obsessed it was. Like, there were no traditionally attractive people as any of the representative models inside society. Now, there's a safe way, I think, to understand that when we only focus on the most outrageous and particular beauty standards, you can create a hyper reality where people do have an unhealthy perception of what attractive looks like, and that kind of thing. I don't think that, some people will scoff to that discussion, but I don't. I think there is a level at which we obscure what true beauty is by airbrushing the top 0.001% of attractive people and putting them on everything and making that the only thing that people understand is attractive. I get that. However, we went entirely the other direction, and we're just putting people who are obviously very unattractive. No one would want to purchase anything that they were wearing, and that became the standard. And it was very clear because they were sending a message about the standards of our society, right? And and very often the standards of our society were cited as, white and heteronormative and all these things, right? It's the laundry list of different things that they complain about. Our culture is oriented towards these traditions and these understandings and these frames, and so your representation of beauty is inherently flawed because it's white in nature. And so the way to subvert it is to put the ugliest person on there, or put the darkest person on there, not feature anyone who you might think of as an attractive European. So that's the first thing they did that obviously transgressed the paradigm. But there also seems to have been a general hatred for Sydney Sweeney as a person before this. And again, I don't know much about her, right? Like, I can't, again, I don't think I can cite you a single thing she's in. But I have seen a lot of the hate online, and some of it seems to be mainly that she doesn't make her entire life about like hating men, right? Like, her persona is not, well, I'm going to cut my hair as short as possible and dye it pink and tell you that you're a horrific man for noticing that I'm attractive. She seems to like the attention. She seems to welcome the attention. That might be its own critique of her as a person. I don't know, but it's certainly not it's certainly for many people refreshing just to have someone presented to them that doesn't hate them for noticing they're attractive, right? Like that's okay. And then finally, the obsession with pointing out that people inherit to any degree positive traits from their ancestors is a very strange thing, because of course we've fallen into this highly atheistic, highly secular culture obsessed with, I love science, I love heckin' science, right? Like, you young earth creationist, I'm gonna own you. Like, that was, a good amount of my like teenage years and early adult years was having to hear constantly about how stupid Christianity was and how idiotic it was, the idea that you would censor any kind of science. And yet the minute you point out like a basic truth about genetics, that you pass on the most fit characteristics, through this kind of selection, this kind of mating habit, and that this produces results that are better often because of this process, this is somehow heresy, right? Like, this is the deepest, darkest thing you could ever say, even though it is the most basic implications of the science that these people worship. And that's really when you recognize it has nothing to do with the science or secularity. This is all just its own religion, and Hitler is just Satan, and Nazis are, demons, and all white people are descended from demons, and therefore any acknowledgement that a white person might have a trait that could be carried forward that is in some way desirable just evokes all of this imagery, and that's all blasphemy, and that's what we see just vomited onto these pages.
Yeah, so there are several things there. It's kind of funny how, in a weird way, the difference between the sort of like post-war consensus religion you just described and the Nation of Islam, very, very small, right? That these people are these sort of like distinct, inherently evil genetic population. And society at large has rightly decided that the Nation of Islam, as shown off in the funniest Louis Theroux documentary ever, are ridiculous. And yet inherently they believe the same thing, right? It's just the Nation of Islam is slightly more direct about it. Black Hebrew Israelites, not the same group, but you see a sort of similar dynamic as well. But anyway, one of the interesting things when we talk about the left, right? What is the left? And certainly we can say that the left is about, equality, or that the left is entropy, as, great thinkers have said. But there's a large part of it that leftism is basically just sour grapes, right? It is revenge of the nerds. It's, I am mad because I am not, due to, genetics or, a personality defect or just sheer laziness, I am not high status and I want to be. So I will tear down the people ahead of me. And I think that that's a large part of what you see with this attack on beauty, right? It's, well, beauty makes me feel bad because I'm not like that. And look, like, there is a certain part of physical attractiveness, which is a genetic lottery. That simply is. But, going the kind of like, going to the extreme of saying, well, I feel bad, I never want to feel bad, and so everything must be ugly. Everything around me must be horrible, right? It's literally ruling over a pile of cultural ashes. And so much of the reaction I see to this, part of it is the political stuff, part of it is the anti-white part, which is linked. And I think another part of it is simply, don't remind me that I'm not perfect. Don't remind me that I am comparatively lower status. And I think that sort of extreme resentment, right, is something that we see across all avenues of leftist thought. I hate the rich because I am not rich. I hate the attractive because I am ugly. And you can sort of go down the list and look, like, they certainly church it up more than that. But at the base of it, a lot of it is, as Spandrel would say, right, biological Leninism. If we lived in a hierarchy, right, if we lived in a, what one might call a meritocracy, I know I would be low on the totem pole. So I have to reorganize society. I have to, exert an immense amount of pressure on culture to make sure that ugly people rise to the top of, XYZ industry. It's basically that, it is that sheer ressentiment, what Nietzsche would have called it, right? Played at large. And again, this story doesn't really matter, right? We will probably all have forgotten about this specific instance in 2 or 3 months, but it is a useful sort of like chrysalis, right? You see that trend exemplified in one headline almost perfectly. And it's sort of one of those things where it's like, if I were creating a story to make my enemies look bad, it would be pretty close to this, and they did it to
Right.
themselves.
Well, that's the beautiful thing that the left has done over and over again, right? Whether it be the Dylan Mulvaney cell phones, the obsession with defending George Floyd, or the immigrant who, the illegal immigrant gang banger who is beating his wife but desperately had to be returned from illegal immigration. They can't help but like just step into this stuff, right? It's not just about political power for them. It's certainly about political power, but it's not just. They really are ideologically possessed at a level that drives them to make terrible decisions. Because, like you said, objectively, if you brought this to anyone who is doing like any level of political strategy and said, I'm running with this as my way to attack the right, we're going to attack Sydney Sweeney for being a Nazi because she showed up in a blue jeans ad, they'd be like, get out of here. You're a complete idiot. Like, you're fired. Like, never advise me again. Right. But the left is so ideologically obsessed with this that ultimately they keep stepping on these rakes over and over again. And it's great because they've been talking over and over about how critical it is to win back young men. Young men, we're losing young men, especially young white men. How do we get them back in the party? How do we make them a part of what they're doing? You remember the really very, very, very overweight Latina woman who talked about how much she loved frat guys?
Yes, I do.
And she like immediately got fired after because she like took $20 million and just flushed it down the toilet to try to figure this out. But the minute that an attractive woman is on TV, it's, oh my God, it's the end of the world. You have to end this. There's a very funny comic of some teenage boy looking at a Sydney Sweeney ad and all the online personalities calling this a Nazi advertisement. And he walks over to his dad. He's like, I think I'm a Nazi. It's one of those things where obviously, it's tongue in cheek, but if you were a recruiter for a mid-century political ideology, creating this type of advertisement would be your best friend. Creating this entire backlash, you couldn't have cooked up a better one for this. But it really shows that the left is completely oblivious to this, right? Because we ran all these Sports Illustrated issues where we put like, trans guys on the cover and everything in swimsuits, and there's this humiliation ritual of forcing trans actors into all of these roles where they don't they shouldn't be. The people were flipping out because I guess there's a Zelda movie coming out and they passed on a trans actor as being Zelda in the movie. And so, there's just all this backlash against why can't we just force the ugliest non-women into roles where attractive women traditionally existed? And also, I can't figure out why men don't want to vote for my party anymore. I've made finding any moderately attractive woman interesting literally the deepest sin in the world. It's fascist, it's Nazi, all this stuff. And for some reason, men don't want to be involved in my political movement. It's an incredible mystery, to be sure.
Well, and to your point, and I understand you sort of referencing the quote unquote cigar slam, right? Is woke going away? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the interesting parts, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here about your argument, is that effectively the left can't control themselves. Because again, right, if you were this Machiavellian power broker sitting at the top of left core, right, sort of tweaking all the knobs and setting out a course, this is an issue you wouldn't touch. Why would you? It does nothing.
And to be clear, these people exist in the party, right? Like, I'm sure that if Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi was really sitting down to do any of this, they'd be like, get that trash out of here, right? But they're not in charge anymore, and that's the important point.
Well, exactly. And there's a degree to which they almost can't stop themselves from making poor decisions on a game theory perspective. Because again, right, like, young men are an incredible force in society. They provide a great deal of energy, a great deal of capability. They are ultimately the future of any organization. And, and I'm glad you brought up that woman, re-engaging men for the DNC, because that was sort of the perfect clash, right? Between, on one hand, you have people saying, hey, we need to solve this issue. We can't simply designate, young men an enemy group. So you see that inclination. Well, how is it executed, right? They get this sort of like absurd stereotype, right? You can imagine them popping out of like a Stone Toss comic or something like that, as this kind of like cartoonish, feminist leftist, going out to college parties, right, to try to get the guys to vote for, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg in 2028. And you're like, okay, this is proven to me. You are unable to help yourselves. You're unable to sort of pull back from what you really want to do. You're unable to stop saying the quiet part out loud, which, I mean, as we get to the next story, it is very clear they are unable to keep the quiet part quiet.
And, there's been a concerted effort from some inside the conservative movement to keep the quiet part very quiet, right? You've heard the woke right and their dangerous ideas of pointing out the obvious fact that actually progressivism might have some Marxist elements, certainly is got Marxist theory as its explanation as to why it's doing what it's doing academically. But in practice, it is purely like resentment against white Christians in the United States. It's very clearly what it is on a regular basis. And, we've been, guys like you and me have been saying, look, we hate Marxists, we hate communists, it's evil, helicopters. Yeah, I'm with you. Okay. But it's important to recognize it's not just an economics program. Okay. That race communism, in race communism, the race is a true animating feature. It's not just, oh, I wish I could take your stuff. It is. They're going to take your stuff too, but they're going to take your stuff because you're white. Right. And this is really critical, because when you look at the violence, when you look at the hatred, when you look at the exclusion from employment, when you look at, just the constant ways in which there is accepted bigotry in the United States, it can't just be Marxism. It can't be Marxism by itself. It is animated by something different. It is a deeper and more tribal understanding of human collectivity and the way that it operates. And if you don't get that, if you don't understand that under that Marxism, or maybe on top of it, however you want to envision your ideological stack, involved very deeply in this is that pure and unadulterated race hatred for one particular group that we have said is, well, more or less fair game for the culture, right? And people are tired of it. And if you don't address that specifically, if you just keep saying, oh, well, it's all Marxist dogma, then you're missing the forest for the trees here. And more importantly, people are going to go to someone who notices the truth, right? Like, people are going to keep watching innocent white people get killed or beat up. They're going to see their, relatives of European descent not able to get into college, not able to get jobs. They're going to see the open hatred declared for them in the media. And they're going to say, well, if these conservatives won't talk about it, if they're just going to pretend it's all, economic communism, I'm going to go to listen to someone who will address these issues, because they have to be addressed. And, to be fair, as much as there has been this attempt at containment inside the right on this, inside the conservative movement, it's very clearly failing. I'm seeing people who used to try to use the phrase woke right, or try to wear it, even they are declaring stuff like this blatantly anti-white, right? People who would not use the phrase before are using it now. And I think that's good. I think, as silly as the story is, it is good that that is the development we're seeing, because this opens up people to grasp that, okay, this is a frame in which you must recognize this issue and you must address this issue. The communism is bad. The Marxism is bad. I'm with you. But if we do not understand this aspect, and we do not very swiftly and forcefully address the way in which white people are treated in the United States by both its institutions and its media and a percentage of its population, things are going to get really bad. And if you have any interest in something approaching moderately successful race relations in the United States, you have to end the open season on white people. It's simply unacceptable.
Well, certainly, right? Because look, having a multicultural society is sort of playing the game on hard mode, right? It is more difficult than a homogenous population, but it can be done, right? There are ways to do that. And we've seen, different empires figure out ways to do it. But this sort of asymmetric game where one group is basically allowed to be denigrated and spoken about in some cases, right, exterminate terms, that builds resentment very naturally, right? People look around and they say, like, why are you treating me like this? Why am I this sort of designated enemy class? And that is not conducive to a healthy society long term. And this is a problem that can be fixed, right? This is not an insurmountable issue, But within the current paradigm, where there's this sort of one-way aggression officially tolerated and in many cases written into law, that is not a stable situation. And so when people attack the woke right, they'll say things like, "Oh, you are, ginning up hatred, you are fomenting division." And that's not the case. What the woke right, quote unquote, is doing is recognizing this division is here. It has existed for 70 years at this point. And it is a wedge. It is being driven into the country. And in order to extricate that, you need to make a change. And, it's sort of a truism, right, in self-help or a 12-step program. But the first step is recognizing you have a problem. And merely continuing to stick your head in the sand and say, well, this is gross and icky and I don't want to talk about it. It may make you feel better, but it doesn't actually address the core of the issue, right? People aren't just making these stories up to get clicks on the internet, right? They aren't simply doing this because you get paid an extra $1,000 on the end of the month if you incite, an extra 3% racial division, right? They're doing it because this is a widely recognized issue that is not being addressed by, shall we say, certain figures in the conservative movement.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear, we're not adopting, this frame. We're not going to be picking up the newspeak or calling ourselves anything approaching the woke right. It's entirely a term of slander, but you're right to say that the people who have been slandered in this way have been trying to point out something that's critical. And no matter how much you try to hide your head in the sand, this is only going to get worse for you if you continue to do so. And like I said, I think more and more of the right is recognizing this, that they can't continue to bottle this up. I understand the concern. Like, they don't want everything racialized. They don't want some race war in America. I'm with you. I'm not looking for that either. But the way to avoid that is to address this issue now. If you're unwilling to address this issue and point it out and speak the truth about it now, that will come, and it will come in a much worse form than what you are worried about in the current scenario. You have to address this, and you have to acknowledge even, the frame around it. It is racial. It's racial to its core. There is no way to avoid this aspect of the situation. And, carefully dancing around that language, pretending it doesn't exist, calling anybody who isn't interested in ignoring that fact some kind of Marxist or some kind of, the horseshoe theory, the right and the left are exactly the same. That does you nothing unless your entire goal is to play containment. And even then you're going to fail in that aspect. But that said, enough of the Sydney Sweeney stuff. Like we said, that was far more the lighthearted manifestation of this. But now we're going to look at like what this actually leads to, right? So I'm gonna try to show this. I don't know where YouTube is on, kind of putting this stuff on. So hopefully we're not going to get any kind of strikes here. But I haven't tried like any of this in a while, so we'll give it a shot. So here is the video in question of what occurred. This is the Cincinnati Jazz Festival. Now, as I understand, it used to be a jazz festival, but since no one really listens to jazz anymore, and most African Americans have moved on to R&B and hip hop and other stuff like that, it's mainly a celebration of that stuff and not jazz itself. But here is the video of the confrontation. Now, obviously, this is horrible, and I do want to provide the context here. I could not immediately find the other context I wanted for this clip, but there is a version of this clip in which the woman in question is coming in to break up that fight because we can see there was some kind of shoving match, some kind of yelling match between a old white gentleman and a black gentleman in that crowd, and that occurred with kind of like a slap from the white guy. Again, they were kind of shoving, so it's one of those natural escalation situations. I don't know that, obviously without hearing what was being said, I can't infer. I mean, I can guess, but I don't know for sure who actually is to blame for this really going into a more physical direction. That said, obviously things quickly get beyond just a personal confrontation. I understand, if you're a man and another man shoves you, you have the right to defend yourself. I'm not going to stand here and pretend like two grown men settling some kind of confrontation through minimal violence is unacceptable. If a guy smacks you, no matter what his color, you have a right to in some way reciprocate to a certain level. But that's not what happens. What happens instead is this turns into a full-on beatdown. Instead, the black guy eventually immediately throws hands in a much more aggressive way. Multiple people jump in on his side because the crowd is predominantly black. It quickly becomes like a prison yard fight, right? You don't know who started what or what is the actual impetus. You just know that your side is your race. That's all that the crowd seems to know immediately. And it is a large crowd of mostly black men, but some black women. They beat up the couple the white man there. They also beat up a couple of other white guys who seem to get involved in trying to break up the fight. And most horrendously, the one that most people are focusing on is the one we watch, which was the woman who obviously was trying to get in there. Maybe she knew someone, we don't know at this time, but she was trying to pull people away from the fight, and she gets knocked out in what is the most brutal scene there. And I think, people who have been in this situation know, if you've ever been at large festivals of this kind, unfortunately, there is an unspoken rule that there is like a racial divide in many of these scenarios. I distinctly remember, in Tampa, where I went to college, they have like the Gasparilla Festival for the pirate ships that came in. They celebrate the fact that Buccaneers landed in Tampa Bay. And, they have a bunch of people walking around these festivals. And it's well known that if you're a white guy and you see a crowd of 30, 40 black guys standing there, don't walk towards that crowd because they will suck you in and you will get beat down. And we watched it. There were several white guys who did not know this rule and made the mistake of like just walking by themselves instead of, walking in a group with at some distance. And they just got ripped off the street and immediately beat down. And so you have this really horrific scene. Again, I understand some level of self-defense being justifiable, but this clearly went very beyond self-defense and quickly became a full-on race riot, basically. And that is why people are reacting the way that they did.
Yeah, so there are several things there. Someone who's been to a few music festivals, similar interaction. This is just sort of assumed knowledge, right? Especially at bigger festivals with sort of mixed acts, right? Where you'll have like a hip hop show on one stage and then like, sad guitar music on the other. It's very clearly like, even if it's not stated explicitly, like there's an understanding there. I think one of the other relevant features here is obviously the savage way that this woman was beaten, and also the reaction from the crowd, right? Which is basically to stand around and laugh. And look, like scuffles happen. But this is not simply, two guys getting into a dust up outside of a bar, right? As you said, this has much more in common with like brutal prison violence, where you have, multiple people jumping someone. And again, sadly, this is not a new thing, right? Perhaps the most egregious example is Reginald Denny, right? Who was beaten within an inch of his life during the Rodney King riot, right? Literally nothing to do with anything, just a guy driving a truck, but he got pulled out and, smashed into the dirt. And again, the coverage, which you're, about to play a clip of here, of this issue is, shall we say, dramatically different than, to quote a good old conservative byline, if the roles were reversed, right? Very clearly, there is an element of racial bias in this. This is not treated as if it were, a group of guys at a trailer park, right? Just, the white trash family throwing it down in the Bob Evans parking lot, right? This is being handled very, very specifically. And it's not unreasonable to look at this and say, why are they biased? Why are they acting with, racial favoritism and what seems to be a pretty egregious example of racialized violence, which I have been assured for my entire life is the most serious issue in our society, right? This
Right.
is the point of America, to get rid of this. And if that's true, you can probably hear my sarcasm dripping through the mic. If that's true, why are these men not being, railroaded, right? Why are they not seeing the sort of, just excoriation in the press or in the court system that we see when the roles are reversed? Well, it's actually a pretty easy answer. They just don't like white people. it's really not that complicated. And obviously this sorry, I caught myself there. This rather Rubenesque police chief is gonna put that very clearly.
Yeah, so before we play the clip real quick, I just want to acknowledge a few critical points you made there. First, this incident is sadly very common, right? It's caught on camera, and because it has caught the national news attention, they have actually made 5 arrests in this case. But if we're honest, we know that this would barely make the front page or would barely make page 15 of a local newspaper in most instances. And when we look, most violence, to be clear, statistically is between the same race, right? Black people kill or fight black people, white people kill or fight white people. Majority of the time, it is within your own community that violence happens. However, when violence does cross, when it does become interracial, the ratio of black violence against whites to white violence against blacks is massive. Black people commit like exponentially more violence against white Americans than vice versa. Not, again, to say that white Americans do not commit violence against black people, but it's not even close comparatively when you look at the numbers and the percentages. Even though that's the case, we know that if there was a mob of 5 white guys beating up some black guy somewhere who wandered into the wrong neighborhood, that would be the only thing we ever heard about. In fact, we know this is true because I'm sure you remember the Ahmaud Arbery case, where before even like Matt Walsh, God bless him, has gotten been on a far more based streak recently. But even then, he was talking about how, oh well, this is very clearly a lynching, and this is we have to stop this kind of racial violence in the United States. So even the conservative commentariat will immediately assume that there is some kind of white on black violence that exists. Now, again, this is not a blank check. Obviously, you should not be running around beating people up based on their race in any situation. However, it's very clear that when that does occur, it is disproportionately carried out by black Americans against white Americans, and that is not covered in any way. It is not news. So the fact that Sydney Sweeney was by far more important in this conversation, like her terrible crime of transgressing against black, transvestite individuals who expect to get all the modeling jobs. Like the fact that that was a far bigger news story than this violence says it all, right? Like that's how little we even register this type of violence against a white woman in the United States at this point. Now, in addition to that, we're going to hear from this police chief, but you guys already know where this is going.
Another topic I want to cover real quick. Social media and journalism and the role it plays in this incident. And yes, guys, that's you. That is you.
Just that the school marm lecture before we even get to anything else is just, I'm talking to you. Did you leave your blocks out for someone else to clean up? That's the attitude we're getting.
Also, even contained in this, and I've seen this clip, and yet this still makes me mad. The fact that she is visibly much more annoyed that people are talking about this than that it occurred in the first place.
Right.
It boggles the mind, right? That this, a alleged law enforcement officer, right? Someone who is there to protect the physical safety of their citizenry. It's like, well, why are you talking about it? Why are you upset about it? Right? That is, in her mind, right, the real issue at play here, that people are talking about a crime instead of the fact that the crime happened in the first place.
Jay, let me ask you this. It's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it's worth speculating on here. A lot of people point out that, it's white women. White women are what's creating the woke problem, right? And I always have a little bit of a recoil on that because it's like, well, have you seen the voting numbers for black women or for Asian women or for Jewish women? Like comparatively, like white women actually voted for Trump this time around. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of, crazy liberal white women out there, but I do have a problem with just characterizing them as like the core demographic that is driving all of this. That said, you have to notice that many white women are very passionate about social justice, as our good friend Bogbeef famously said once. And the fact that this woman, whose job, in theory, is to protect citizens in, under her care. The fact that she is not very clearly in any way emotionally affected by the brutal violence that was done to a white woman, to someone who could be a child, could be a relative. The fact that just has zero impact on the way that she approaches this, and seems to have zero impact on a lot of people who hold similar views, is kind of fascinating. Like, do these people not even worry about their own safety? Like, whatever ideology, I hate, my college told me to hate white men, whatever, I get it. But at some point, doesn't just self-preservation kick in? Doesn't the desire to not see people who kind of look like you beaten to a pulp for standing on a street and trying to keep other people from getting beat up, doesn't that in any way impact you? I just feel like at some point there has to be appeal to just like basic human response to this kind of thing.
One would think.
One would. I didn't know if you had any.
Sorry, no, that was just a one one line response, right? It's
fair enough.
To your point, yes, this is what a reasonable human being would do. However, it may surprise you. It doesn't seem like this lady was necessarily selected for her position by being the most reasonable and capable law enforcement officer. And
are you suggesting this was not a meritocratic selection, sir?
I might have a hint. Maybe. I'm not sure yet. I'll do more research.
All right, let's hear the rest of what she's saying here.
Social media, the post that we've seen, does not depict the entire incident. That is one version of what occurred. At times, social media and mainstream media and their commentaries are a misrepresentation of the circumstances surrounding any given event. What that does, that causes us some difficulties in thoroughly investigating the activity.
So when people know what actually happened, when they can see what really happened, it makes it difficult for us to spin a narrative that we need to control. Now, to be fair, to give the devil her due here, she is correct that social media often does present a skewed picture of events, and that's why I wanted to provide you a context for that clip, because there was an altercation prior to that woman being struck. I didn't want you to just think that that was the case, that she just was walking down the street and out of nowhere she got cold cocked by a bunch of black guys who get angry at her. However, even in the context, even with the full context of the clip, there is zero justification for what occurred here. And this is what I think, grinds my gears in this scenario. The idea that if the person was just kind of a little racist, that's fine, right? Like, I already see this justification. There are big tweets that blew up that got, several million views saying, oh, well, the white guy was probably being racist, so it's fine. And that statement is just insane, and we hear it over and over again. This has always struck me. I always make this reference because it was such a horrible thing that it just echoes in my brain every time I see behavior like this. The story of Cannon Hinnett, who's like a 5-year-old who got his bike stolen and confronted the person who did, and he got shot while he was on his bike after talking to a black man. He did not get his bike stolen, I don't believe. I misspoke there. However, was shot in the face at that time. And the fact that the first thing that his mother said was, hey, my son wasn't racist because someone said he said the N-word. Like, I don't care if he screamed the N-word through a bullphone, through a microphone for 15 minutes. He was just screaming, shrieking through a bullhorn right in your face. You do not get to murder a 5-year-old in cold blood because he said something you don't like. And yet that was the very real justification. We saw the same thing recently, obviously, with the young man who was stabbed in the confrontation with the high school track meet. And the very first response by his black assailant was, well, he was being racist to me. Or you guys are only noticing that I murdered this guy because you're racist, right? And this is like some kind of automatic defense of like, well, I have a blank check to commit whatever form of violence I want against a white person if I claim they said something racist at that time. And they usually can't go more than 5 minutes without themselves then saying something horrifically racist about white people. But the fact that like that is just treated as, you know, a carte blanche to enact this kind of violence on a regular basis in this country is completely unacceptable. And this is why we have to destroy this taboo, right? A lot of people say, well, why do you want to destroy these taboos? And the answer is because these taboos, they validate this kind of violence, and we simply cannot allow that to continue to happen.
Well, exactly. And it comes down to, what does society treat as the most unpardonable sin? And, there are a lot of particularly great examples we could put in there, right? Pick your least favorite action. But if it's racism, and it has been amply shown that racism can mean literally anything it needs to be, not only is that effectively making rudeness the ultimate ill of society, but it's rudeness with an ever-changing definition, right? It sort of reminds you of, Japan, right? Where if a commoner looked at a samurai or, stepped on his boots, he'd get cut in half with no criminal investigation whatsoever, right? This protected class, if you challenge their honor in any way, then your life is forfeit. And look, right? Like buried in all of this is this sort of, second class citizen status, where if you are one of the out group, you can be, and you dishonor a client. Well, guess what? Anything that comes to you is fair game, right? It is a genuine double standard. And when we look back to ideas of, a narco-tyranny, who is policed, who is not, this is very much what we see. And it's particularly galling when we see the way in which selectively edited clips are distributed on social media involving police shootings, for example. So you may remember there was a rather large lady, former WNBA player, who had a psychotic break and ended up losing her life after running at a police officer with the butcher knife, right? Relatively, I mean, it's obviously a tragic case, but as far as justified use of force, running at someone with a butcher knife screaming, "I'm going to kill you," I mean, that's a pretty easy court case, right? But yet, despite the fact that the officer was Asian, there was no white people involved whatsoever, and that when shown in context, it was very, very clear that this was a justified response that the police officer did not want to resort to, right? Minutes of him trying to talk her down. Well, it was slotted into the narrative as another example of, white racists gunning down, innocent POC. And again, right, that surely has happened, right? That is a situation which mathematically can occur. But because it fits into this broader, shall we say, like race communist narrative, where, the eternal kulaks must be dispossessed. They must have, any sort of social standing taken away from them. They must be denigrated in every possible setting, and in cases like this, subjected to violence. Well, it doesn't matter. And again, just going to go back to this again, it's not that complicated. They just hate white people. It's really all there is to it. And all of this language to church it up is entirely opportunistic. If this was a situation like that shooting in Northern Virginia of the WNBA player, can you imagine this woman screaming at the media, hectoring people like a school marm who's lost her temper about, distributing edited clips which made her look bad? Of course not, right? Any of these justifications are post hoc, after the case. It is simply a justification for what they wanted to do anyway, which is effectively to discriminate against people like you, me, and members of our audience.
And ultimately, this is where people have to come to the conclusion, right? That you look at this police chief in Cincinnati, and it's hard to escape the fact that that police force does not exist to stop violence against you. It exists to stop you from stopping violence. That they're clients of the regime. They have a free pass. They are allowed to hurt you. They are allowed to injure you. They are allowed to insult you. They are allowed to ban you from schools. They're allowed to ban you from universities. They're allowed to turn you down from a job based on your skin color. And ultimately, they're allowed to loot your city, to attack you at your home, to beat you down in public. And should you attempt to seek justice on your own, you better bet you're going to jail, right? If you are even someone like Michael Penny, who decides it's time to, or Daniel Penny, who decides it's time to defend people in a subway car against someone who is of the opposite color, they're going to destroy your life. But if you were to actually seek justice, to say, this person has beaten my sister or my wife or my daughter unconscious in the street, and they're going to pay a price for that, whether the cops are going to exact it or not, the cops are going to stop you, not that person. And it becomes very clear that the purpose of the government is no longer to protect the citizens at large, to keep peace at large, to have law and order in general, but instead to ensure that those who are being victimized do not seek any kind of reasonable defense or retribution for the crimes that are committed against them. And that's when things get very bad. That's when you get to the point where either people become entirely servile or become revolutionary, because there are no other options, right? If you have legitimate government authorities with the monopoly on violence saying, we don't protect guys with your skin color, there are only so many options left, right? And it's not like we haven't gone through many of them at this point. And so I am obviously not calling for violence in any way here. However, people will, and you'll understand why. Because what other option did you give them? They cannot avail themselves of the law. There are legitimate means for justice. And how long can that exist before people take things into their own hands? And this produces exactly the scenarios that everybody warns us about. And so I think that, again, as silly as the Sydney Sweeney thing is, compared with this, it ultimately really drives us towards this understanding that these issues must be addressed, and they must be addressed immediately. And I want to give credit where it's due. There are a number of Black voices that have spoken out about this. There are a number of honorable Black commentators who have said, this is unacceptable. We cannot live life like this. Black people cannot behave this way. They cannot be allowed to have this. And so, they're not the majority. There is still, I think, unfortunately, the majority of the Black community is still heavily invested in this kind of hall pass that they are getting, this privilege that they are getting for this type of violence. But there are voices speaking out against this. I don't want to pretend it's just one-sided, because it is courageous for people like that to speak out. And I Godspeed to them. I appreciate them recognizing the importance of this justice, even if it doesn't benefit them directly, even if it will even put them at odds with their audience or people in their community, recognizing the importance of having that kind of message. But that said, we have quite a few super chats stacking up, so we need to get to the questions of people. Before we do, Mr. Burden, where can people find your excellent work?
Yeah, sure. So my primary output is the Jay Burden Show, which you can find on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And again, Auron, thank you so much for having me on. This was a good time.
Of course. And, I am a little disappointed that you didn't continue your in character. We had Cillian Murphy, we had Steve Jobs. I was hoping we'd, a new personality every week, a lookalike, maybe show up, in the Hulkamania, after the end.
That would have been a good idea.
Something.
Yeah, I just need to start blasting 80s steroids, get a skullet, and I could just be Hulk Hogan reborn.
Yeah, I'm just hoping for a running gag, where we can do some kind of reference. I mean, we keep things light here at the Auron MacIntyre show.
Unless this episode, we'll shoot another one. I'll go dress up. It'll be great.
Excellent. Burden Media running wild. All right, let's go to the questions of the people here. Tiny Stupid Demon says, can someone start a GoFundMe or something to get Mr. Burden a bookcase or brick wall or some kind of better background? This off-white thing is just sad. Yeah, we are going to be getting a fashion makeover for the set here, right, Mr. Burden?
Well, if you go to the Jay Burden Show on either Subscribestar, Substack, Gumroad, or Patreon, you can join the special Buy Me a Background tier, and you'll get my episodes early and ad-free. So Tiny Stupid Demon, there is a way for you to do that.
Excellent. Yes, be the change you want to see in your content creators world. Let's see here. Weird Ecurb says, above average women have an incentive to encourage lower beauty standards because it tilts the scales in their favor. Less competition. Many people have brought up that that dynamic, and I'm sure that exists to a decent degree. I think we are looking at something a little wider when we come to the complete inversion of beauty that exists inside of the woke movement and what it did to fashion and advertising, all these things. But I'm sure the dynamic you're discussing was at play to some extent. Sorry, hiccup there. K-Max McDonald said, the media pulled an anti-white trifecta this week. Sydney Sweeney, Cincinnati, Ohio Jazz Festival, and CNN calling a Midtown New York shooter a white male. Will media ever stop this? It only gets worse. It is quite horrible, and it'll only stop when these people are replaced or sued into oblivion. And we should be working to do both as aggressively as possible. That's another reason to support guys like Mr. Burden and The Blaze. Alternative media is the key to making these people as irrelevant as possible. They're already dying. The podcast sphere is already eating into most of their influence. But the faster that death comes, the better. Let's see here. We have Based Hillbilly says, why do commenters insist on talking about SS? I don't care. Oh, the Sydney Sweeney stuff. Like I said, I understand why that's general. Don't do a lot of pop culture stuff on here. We do sometimes. It's okay to have fun. It doesn't always have to be the worst thing happening in the world today every time. That has its own downside. But I thought this one was important because, like I said, it did transition into larger issues impacting our society. Sydney Sweeney herself, who cares, but it is a mirror that reflects, I think, many of the things that we are trying to address here. Tim Miller says the left hates white women. They do. Again, this is why I kind of shy away from people who just throw out the white women, the white liberal women, they're the problem. Don't let the media make your sister or your wife or your friend the enemy. They might have bad ideology. They might have absorbed bad doctrine. But remember that women tend to be the moral enforcers in society. That's kind of their role, but they'd always determine what morality they're enforcing. And so, women who are handed a morality that is obscene will, enforce it in a way that is harmful to society. Women who are given a morality that I think is uplifting and, they serve a critical role in policing that. That's why the Karen meme itself was a little bit of a little toxic, because it ultimately, I think, fingered a aspect of female behavior that we kind of want to exist to some degree, but it needs to be harnessed the right direction.
Well, and one other thing, remember, obviously straight white male Christians are, the devil, and straight white female Christians are like Judas in his teeth, right? Like only one step up. And I mean, you see that in times of crisis, right? Obviously white women are still more on side for the Democrats than white men are, but it's not by much. And the one point in their favor, which is their femaleness, is very clearly and quickly outweighed by all the others. And so that's really a matter of time. You even saw that during, the previous elections where, my wife was told she wasn't a woman because she didn't care about voting, right? Like that very quickly goes out the window. And so I find myself agreeing with you, Auron.
Political femininity right next to political blackness there. Yeah. Crooper Weirdo says, what do you say to people who talk about we figured this race stuff out in the 90s? It's like they don't get what we're trying to say. Yeah, and there is a delusion, right? There's a reason that our friend Academic Agent calls this Return to Fresh Prince, even though, the Rodney King riots happened in the 90s and the O.J. Simpson trial and all kinds of pretty clear examples of racial animus and division. There is this idea that because there had been, I guess, less division to some degree in media in the 90s, that meant that, all of these problems were solved. But clearly that's just not the case. And pretending like we're returning to a time that never happened is foolish. It's not going to resolve anything. Can you convince people of this? Well, I don't think you're going to argue them out of that right away. You can present the evidence. You can show them the fact that the Rodney King, and the LA riots and everything happened. But ultimately, the way I think to show them that is to show them things like Sydney Sweeney and to show them things like this beatdown, to show them that ultimately this attitude is pervasive. And whether you're delusional and believe that it just didn't exist in the 90s, or whether you do have a firm grasp of that, the answer is ultimately we have to address this issue. It's not going away. No matter how many times you call for Return to Fresh Prince, that's not coming, at least at the very minimum, until we address this entirely.
Well, and to your point, right, the Reginald Denny case I brought up, that was what, 92, right? Yeah. Like it's so clearly a cope, right? It's so clearly a convenient narrative to hand that is not at all based in reality.
It's amazing. Just Google race riots in America if you want to have fun at some point. The delusional idea that people have about the civil rights movement and race relations in the 80s and 90s. is just in no way accurate. It's not even close. Dissident Soaps with a very generous gift. Thank you very much, man. Really appreciate it. He says, I never have time to watch this stuff live, but keep up the good work, Auron, Jay Burden. Try doing some good work sometime.
With friends like these, who needs enemies?
Brutal.
I mean, I guess if someone's gonna insult me, at least paying Auron $300 to do it is, better than not, I guess. So thank you very much, Dissident Soaps. I appreciate it.
Well, now you're now going to be my dunk tank, right? I just didn't invite you on to antagonize the audience until they get to pay money to insult you. But
I'm
I will
not too proud to accept that.
It's the worst roles that one can have professionally. But I will say this: if you have not tried Dissident Soaps, excellent soap, excellent shampoo. I use it personally. I'm a fan. So appreciate
the official position of the Jay Burden Show is that Dissident Soaps will turn you gay.
Oh man, brutal. Let's see. Sarkinator says, any memories of the late great Hulkster? Just the basic ones. I'm not one of these adult wrestling fans, honestly. I know some people are. I find that pretty cringe. But I'm a nerd in other areas, so I'm not gonna try to be holier than thou on this. But I had the same memories as a kid growing up. The Hulk, fighting all these different characters in what I think is a WEC at the time. I don't know if was he in the W. They had the two different promotions instead of they weren't all combined at the time. But anyway, I remember him being this kind of all-American good guy in most of it. And then I was around for a little bit when they turned him into the bad guy. He did the big heel turn in the NWO thing. Like I said, I didn't really watch any of that after I got into like early high school or something. But I have very fond memories when I was young, and I always remember my great grandmother liked to watch professional wrestling. She called them her stories. Like those were her soaps. So always fun memories of sitting down and watching a few matches there as well.
Well, I think that the most kind of recent iconic moment, sort of parallel to Trump descending the escalator, was Hulk Hogan introducing him at the RNC.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Trumpomania is gonna run wild, and then when he's saying like they shot my hero, like say what you will about either man involved, that's a great moment, right? Like that is a top tier wrestling promo. It was a great moment, and obviously the fact that he bankrupted Gawker. I mean, if he did nothing else, that would make him a hero in my book.
Right. Yeah, and that by itself should get you a statue, right? We start with Pat Buchanan, but Terry Bollea goes right next to him, right? I think that's an excellent plan. Gabby of Limburg says, Jay Burden, subscribe, Axios Coaching Fitness, join OGC New York meetup, come. All right, so we got a couple things there. Make sure to subscribe to Jay Burden, not Joy Burden. He is not a bad MSNBC commentator with a terrible wig. I guess Access Coaching is probably a sponsor of yours. I feel like
yes, it is. That's JD, personal friend of mine.
Okay, and then of course OGC. They are trying to start a chapter in New York. So if you are near New York City, you should most certainly meet up with some excellent young men of character at the OGC. Sean Weiland says nobody hates women more than other women. Many such cases. Enrico Palazzo says Sydney Sweeney don't season jeans enough. I completely forgot about that meme. I completely forgot about that whole controversy, but yeah, that's great.
I have no comment.
Tiny Rick says Robin DiAngelo was right. White people don't know how to talk about race. So here we are talking about it. And what do you people call us? Racist. Great topic. And guess, love your takes. Yeah, we heard endlessly about how we need to have a very serious conversation. We need to have very serious conversation on race. All right, let's do it. All right, let's have that conversation. Oh, wait, no.
Yeah, I don't think you're prepared for the implications of that, right?
Yeah, no, we're taking your advice. We're having that conversation. You can cry in your milk all you want. Or I guess you wouldn't. It's white milk is white supremacist.
Yeah, in the soy milk.
Mm. Joe McDermott says, if we can't stop this anti-white violence, then Trump is in office. It strongly means we will never will, and implications of that lead to Fed posting. Again, hard to argue with that. Again, this is people who talk about the concern for some kind of racial violence need to understand that if you do not address these things now, if you are not willing to jump into this now, it will only get worse. And you're right to say that with Trump in office and with the federal government, at least nominally under right-wing control, if you cannot address this in serious ways now, it's not going to get addressed. And that will just lead to violence. And honestly, that's in the best case scenario, right? There is a worst case scenario where there is no violence and, these people are just beaten with no justice and nothing ever occurs. And so you want to avoid all of that. You want to cut all of that off at the pass. You never want to escalate to that point. And the way to do that is to come out very firmly and very strongly and not be scared of discussing this now, addressing this in very real ways. Florida Henry says, police and fire chiefs are the city managers' yes men padding their retirement. Unfortunately, that is very often the case. And if you don't understand the city management relationship, check into that. It's as somebody who got to report on a lot of municipal government, I won't say it's fascinating, but it is a great way to understand why all of your local governments are absolute disasters. K-Max McDonald says, in the academic world, how long has this notion been that only white people can be racist? Based on this definition, no other group can be accountable for the racism. How do we change this? It's been repeated over and over again in academia for several decades. At its genesis, it exists, in the 1960s, right? Like that's the power dynamic being the definition of racism is clearly something that came out of Marxist revolutionary thinking in the 60s. That said, it's been, covered up and prettied up in a lot of academic language at this point. But the only way to change this is to, salt the universities, just to strip them of their endowments, sell off their buildings, and salt the land that they sit on.
As a wise man once said, I'll know I've won when there are tanks in Harvard Yard, and yep. I concur.
Yep. The solution is there. Wokeness is over when we have the tanks in Harvard Yard. Anti Sydney Sweeney stuff is bioluminescent cope. Yep. Again, a lot of people expressing this, and it's very clear that there is a spiteful mutant, as Edward Dutton calls the phenomenon aspect. Some will call it bioluminescent, but however you want to label it, very clear that resentment is deep under there. Axios, hey, there he is. He gives us a very generous donation along with several beavers. Very appreciate you coming by, sir.
JD, you're supposed to give me the money, not Auron. That's how a sponsorship works.
Dang, blown out. All right, and then Alex also says, make American women beautiful again. The uglification of women, family, and basically everything else by the left seems demonic and iconoclastic. To this day, my largest video on this channel is me pointing out why the left hates beauty. And I'm a little miffed because it overtook my deep theory piece that used to be that. It's just me explaining the very obvious resentment that exists in the left. But if you want to go back to that one, I do think it is a good explanation. It's not super complicated. It is very, very straightforward. But it is important to note that, I think at the end of the day, the left is a revolt against God's order and the hierarchy he established. This comes with ability. This comes with beauty. This comes with civilization, everything about the way that God ordered the world. The left is a rebellion against that. And so I think that you can't see that and then not apply that understanding to the phenomenon around you on a regular basis. All right, guys. Oh, whoa, we got one more snuck in there. Joe McDermott says, antidote for the only white people can be racist. My father was told this when he was drafted and being sent to Vietnam by the U.S. Army. Priorities. Yeah, again, that is something that has existed for a long time, all the way back in the 60s at least. So it's more pronounced now, but it is not a new development. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for coming by. Always great to speak with the awesome Jay Burton. If you would like to help him get a new background, make sure you go help replace the white door in the white room by subscribing and perhaps supporting his channel. If it's your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe on YouTube, click the bell, notifications, all that stuff when you so you know when we're going live. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can watch all of our episodes and get all the behind the scenes stuff. And you can even pick up some of those documentaries about things like the COVID scandal and immigration over at Blaze TV. Thanks everybody for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.